Hi everybody, welcome back to another Writing in the Dark video. I'm Tim Wagner. Today we're going to be talking about writing action in horror. Um, I've written a lot of different tie-ins that have had action in them. Novelizations of movies with action, or just, original novels based on TV series and things like that where there's a lot of action in it. But those are the kind of action scenes that are like action adventure or heroes battling bad guys. In horror, what we tend to have is a normal person, somebody who doesn't have any special abilities or doesn't have any special training, who's in action. And that kind of scene takes a different sort of approach than what you would normally see in movies. So, what's the difference between an action hero and a normal person? Action heroes are trained, they have faster reflexes, they think faster, they make decisions quicker, they aren't scared by violence. They will go ahead and commit violence if they have to, and they're more durable psychologically and physically than regular human beings. In an action adventure movie, we accept this just fine, or action adventure thriller novel or something. We'll accept it just fine. But in horror, the more that your character is like that, the less of a threat whatever it is they're dealing with is going to be to them. So you want your characters to be normal people because the weaker they are in general, or the less skilled they are, less experienced they are, less anything they are, the more the suspense is going to be ratcheted up because they're dealing with something. So there's realistic violence versus stylized or fantasy type violence. Realistic violence, like my ex-wife twice, all she did was fall and break her elbow, different elbows at different times, and was it. She just fell and required surgery and a little metallic screw in there or whatever. Um, the people in movies, they fall, they get beat up, all kinds of stuff happens to them. And Rampage, at the movie, toward the end of it, The Rock is like shot in the damn kidney or something, and he doesn't even bleed. He just runs around for the next 20 minutes of the movie. Um, so in silly movies like that, it's already unrealistic, and that you get these giant monsters running around. It's already like a silly comic book, not a realistic kind of graphic novel type comic book. So realistic violence, it hurts to punch somebody. It if you're running and you're not used to running, you may go ahead and pull a muscle. You may collapse breathless because you're just, like in Zombieland, you're supposed to practice cardio is like number one thing. People aren't necessarily practicing cardio. So when you're writing action scenes, you want to think in terms of realism, at least on the part of the person, the human being, the regular everyday person that's dealing with whatever the threat may be. You also want to think of what's the character's reaction to violence. Most people in real life have never been, if we're lucky, we've never been in a situation where we had to deal with violence or the threat of violence. So people talk about fight or flight, but there's also just the frozen with unable to act because you're unable to believe what's happening. And that can be even doubly so in horror, because what could be happening is that you've got a monster coming at you, or a ghost, or a weirdo serial killer with a mask who might as well be a monster from the way they present themselves. So people might freeze. So one of the things you have to do is think about the different characters in your story, or at least the main character in your story or a given scene, and how would they react to a violent thing suddenly, happening to them, or how would they react to the need to commit a violent act, and maybe it's something they've never done before. Would they be able to do it? People in stories tend to be more active than people in real life. Um, so maybe they'll still commit the violent act, but that doesn't mean it's easy for them. And of course, there's also the aftermath of the violent act. What does that do to them emotionally, physically? And then if they're in a story where they're forced to either be, it's being violence is committed upon them, or they're committing violence, or both, what does that do to a character throughout the course of the story? Um, how does that change them? Do they shut down? Do they only shut down part of themselves and become like a violence machine? And maybe it won't hit them till later. You need to know that kind of stuff in order to write not only a particular violent scene, but also to go ahead and be able to write an entire story or entire novel where violence may be a significant part of it. Looking at my notes over here. What's the character's previous experience with violence, if they've had any? And the more they've had, the more they'll be like an action adventure hero. Because if you have a character with military training, even if they're a realistic character, like somebody set in the real world with no special abilities, they do have special training. Or a police officer might have special training. That they still might be stunned for a moment or two, but their training will kick in. And that gives them more agency, and that means that there's less horror. Because part of horror is helplessness. Part of horror is feeling like you're prey. Part of horror is feeling like you're up against stuff you can't deal with, that you're in part of a nightmare, or in a nightmare, regardless of whether it's realistic horror or not. That's the feel of it. And so if your character is too trained, they may be, more of an action-adventure character. But if your character has also been exposed to violence a lot in their lives, they may immediately shut down, or they may have flashbacks to previous trauma. They may have PTSD because of it. Stuff that happened in their life that had nothing to do with the current threat, but still impacts it because of their reactions to it. So you want to think about that. You also want to think about your character's fitness level, and I alluded to this a little bit earlier. Most people are not training to be warriors, so they are not necessarily strong. They're not necessarily fit. They're not necessarily going to be able to run very far. They certainly don't have proficiency with weapons if they've never tried them before. My favorite fight scene I ever saw was in They Live, the John Carpenter movie, because they have two characters fighting in an alley, and the battle starts off at a really fast pace, and then it gets slower and slower as they get tireder and tireder, because that's what happens during action of any sort. Unless you're trained to deal with it, you got to build up of lactic acid in your muscles, and you get tired. So if your fitness level of your characters are just normal everyday humans, they probably are not fit enough to engage in, a lot of fighting for any kind of length of time, just physically. So you want to think about that too, because their tiredness may creep in, their weariness may creep in during a battle scene. You also want to think about your character's reaction to longer-term violence. What I mean by this is if it's a longer story and they're either being exposed to it, as in somebody's attacking them periodically, or they're attacking other people periodically, or any combination. What does this do to somebody over the course of a story or the course of a novel? Or if you're making a movie, course of a movie. Do they kind of withdraw? It's like in Night of the Living Dead, where Barbara is, the main character, it seems like, at the beginning of the movie, but she's so traumatized by what happens, she becomes like a zombie herself, and eventually, when she does finally try to help, she just gets killed, sucked through the window and eaten up by zombies. So she shut down, and that could happen too. So you want to think about that for different characters. You don't want all your characters in your story to have all the same everything. You want them different kind of relationships to violence, reactions to violence as we go through. People get injured. People forget about that. And they do get injured in action-adventure movies. Like I said about The Rock earlier, they just keep going. But it doesn't take a lot necessarily for somebody to get injured, and they're in pain. Adrenaline will help you get through some of this, but not for very long. Adrenaline doesn't last very long. So you want to think about what are they capable of doing. And then, of course, they got more obstacles to deal with. They got a broken arm, and they still are in this situation. They're not getting medical help. What do they do? What can they do with a broken arm? How bad is the pain? And if you've never experienced it, I've been lucky. I have never had a broken bone that I know of. So I have to do research and talk to people. Luckily for me, my wife used to be a paramedic, so I got a lot of in-house medical information I can draw on. But you could just ask some people, what was it like to try to move with a broken arm before they had their cast put on or whatever. But you want to think about in terms of what they can and can't do. And then, injuries. Are you like making sure they're not bleeding to death? Have they gone ahead and somebody, bound a wound? And if they put a tourniquet on, that will keep the bleeding from going on, but that limb is going to get super numb and not going to be able to be, useless or useful at all. So you want to think of it in terms of, how are people getting injured? How does this impact the rest of the story? It adds great chances for complications, because if you have a character whose knees get injured, they can keep going for a while, but their knee may buckle on them, at a very inopportune moment in the story. So think about the injuries and keep track of them. One of the things I do is I forget a character was injured like 30 pages ago, and then when I'm writing the next scene, I have them running, and it's like, no, wait a minute, they had their knee all screwed up 30 pages ago. They can't run like that, or at least they can't run without pain. And so if you keep like an injury chart, keep it around while you're working, that can help a lot. You also want to think of the effects of fear chemicals, like adrenaline. It doesn't last very long. After it goes away, people tend to feel shaky. They tend to feel sick. Um, because of the adrenaline, if you're not used to operating with adrenaline, you tend to move, if that makes sense. It's like normally if you might move like this, with adrenaline you might go very far, and you can't really aim very well. Your perceptions are kind of messed up a little bit. That's why, maybe that's why the stormtroopers in Star Wars can never hit anything. They're always full of adrenaline. But that kind of stuff does happen. I had a teacher in history once who talked about the OK Corral, the Battle of the OK Corral, and why they kept missing, and that was a big part of it. Even though these people were trained and or at least experienced, in gun battle, it didn't matter. Once the adrenaline starts flowing, your movements are just so hard to control. So you want to think about that, and you want to think about, what happens to them afterwards. Are they throwing up? Do they have a headache? Do they feel chilled? Whatever's going on. All these are effects of fear chemicals. And you just look it up. I give a presentation on this. Maybe someday I'll do a whole video on it. But you can just look up what are the effects of fear chemicals and get an idea of what happens during a battle and what happens after a battle. All right, so the last tip I have for you in dealing with action is how to write it. And to write an action scene is real simple. You just write it as cause and effect. So if your character is throwing a punch, that's a cause. What's the effect? They miss. Okay, they're off balance. Maybe they trip. Or at least they're stumbling. What does their opponent do? Maybe the opponent has a weapon like a club, and so they swing around and hit him in the back of the head because they're already kind of stumbling off in this direction. They get hit in the head, down they go. If they have a gun, maybe as they fall and they spin around, they shoot wildly, hoping they're going to hit this person. And then, does a bullet hit them or not? And you can just go in little chains of cause and effect. You don't need to know how the whole battle is going to go. I mean, you can outline it, you can choreograph it if you want to, just like you're choreographing a dance. But most of the time, once I start a fight, I just need to know the first move. And as long as I know what both characters are capable of in general, I'm able to go ahead and write a pretty decent action scene. And I seem to do pretty good at them. I've had editors tell me, even though I never find them very comfortable, I've worked really hard over the years to try to at least get competent at them. And I find that just writing from that simple kind of cause and effect approach works really well. And so remember too, when you're writing a horror story, unless your horror novel is also an action adventure novel on some level, that they're real people in unreal situations asked to do things that are far above their skill level and comfort level. And you want to go ahead and use the violence to maintain the area of threat, to maintain the suspense for your characters. So don't think of it in terms of your characters kicking ass. It's more like your characters desperately trying to survive throughout the course of a story. All right, so that's about it. Hopefully that'll give you some tips on how to better write some action scenes in your horror. And other than that, see you next time.